There is a kind of tiredness that is hard to explain to someone who does not feel it. It is not exhaustion exactly. It is not sadness. It is something closer to a low, persistent weariness, a slight tension that runs beneath ordinary life and does not fully go away. You feel it when the phone rings from a number you do not recognize, and you let it go to voicemail. You feel it when an email arrives with an offer that seems almost reasonable, and you pause before clicking anything. You feel it standing in a pharmacy, listening to a pharmacist read off side effects, and noticing that you are mentally cataloging which ones sound too convenient, which disclaimers sound rehearsed. You feel it reading a headline and immediately wondering, not whether it is true, but who benefits from you believing it. This wariness has become so ordinary that most people no longer notice it as anything unusual. It is simply the texture of living in this world, at this time. A kind of social weather that has been gray for so long that the idea of a different sky feels almost theoretical. But there was a different sky. Not in some imagined golden age, not in a past that was better in every way. The world of 50 years ago had its own cruelties, its own hidden corruptions, its own injustices that were easier to ignore than to name. And yet something about the social atmosphere was different. People took more at face value. They made more assumptions of good faith. They trusted, without thinking much about it, and that thoughtlessness was itself a kind of wealth, a resource that made daily life lighter than it often feels now. That is what we have lost. Not innocence, not naivety, not the willingness to be foolish, but something more structural, something harder to see, something that, once gone, changes the texture of everything. And the strange part is that most people feel this loss without having a clear name for it. They might say the world has become colder. They might say people are more selfish now, or more distracted, or harder to reach. They might describe a vague sense that the rules have changed, but no one stopped to explain the new ones. What they are often describing, without quite saying so, is the erosion of trust. Not trust in any one person or institution, but something more diffuse, the background trust that makes ordinary cooperation possible. The trust that most people, most of the time, are more or less doing their honest best. The trust that a label is accurate, that a contract means what it says, that a government is working towards something more than its own survival, that a neighbor who smiles actually wishes you well. That trust has thinned. In some places, it has nearly disappeared. And the question worth asking, slowly, without drama, without assigning blame before we understand the problem, is why? Where did it go? When did it start leaving? And what has the world asked us to pay for its absence? Those are the questions this episode will try to answer. Not with false comfort, and not with anger, but with the kind of honest, unhurried attention that a question this large deserves. In the early 1960s, trust in American institutions was near its modern peak. Polling from that era shows that roughly 3/4 of Americans said they trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. That number is not presented here as a political point. It is presented as a social fact. Something that large, that widely shared, tells you something about the atmosphere of an era. That atmosphere was not built on nothing. It was built on a specific set of conditions, some of them good, some of them complicated, but together they produced a world in which most people's experience of institutions was broadly consistent with what those institutions claimed to be. Work was more stable, not perfect. The post-war economy had its injustices and its limits, but for a significant part of the workforce, the relationship between an employer and an employee carried something like a long-term commitment. You showed up, you did your job, and in return you received not just wages but a degree of security, a pension, steady advancement, a clear path. The arrangement was not sentimental. It was practical, but it was also, in a real sense, a promise. And when promises are kept over a long enough period, trust becomes the background of ordinary life. Communities were more geographically stable. People tended to live near where they grew up, near the people they knew, within networks that had their own informal accountability. When your neighbor was also the person whose child went to school with your child, who attended the same church, who used the same butcher, the relationship carried a weight that made casual deception impractical. Not everyone was honest. The human capacity for small dishonesty has not diminished over the decades. But the social fabric made certain kinds of betrayal more costly and more visible. And then, decade by decade, the conditions that sustained that trust began to change. In the 1970s, the economy behaved in ways that the government had said it would not. Inflation arrived and stayed. Oil prices rose and the government appeared helpless. A president resigned in disgrace. The particular damage of Watergate was not simply that a crime was committed. Crimes are committed in every era. The damage was the revelation that the official story and the actual story were two entirely different things. And that once you understood that gap existed, you could never stop looking for it. The 1980s brought a different kind of change. Corporations began to understand their obligations differently. The old compact, "You work here, we invest in you," was replaced by something leaner, more transactional, more focused on the interests of shareholders at the expense of workers. Plants closed, pensions were cut, whole industries relocated or disappeared. The communities that had formed around those industries were not compensated for their loss. And the people who had built their lives on the assumption that the arrangement would hold learned, sometimes in their 50s, that the arrangement had never been a guarantee. Only an expectation. The savings and loan crisis of the late 1980s introduced many Americans to a new experience: watching financial institutions collapse, watching depositors lose money, and watching the cost be distributed to ordinary taxpayers while the people who made the decisions absorbed relatively few consequences. This pattern would repeat. In the early 2000s, two events arrived in quick succession. The first was the revelation that several of the largest and most prestigious corporations in America had been systematically falsifying their finances, not errors, but coordinated deception at scale. Thousands of employees lost not just their jobs but their retirement savings. The executives who oversaw the fraud were wealthy when it began and, in most cases, remained comfortable afterward. The second event was a war whose stated justification, weapons of mass destruction, turned out to be wrong. Whether it was a lie, a failure of intelligence, or something more complicated was debated for years. But the practical result was the same. Official certainty had led people into a large and costly mistake, and the officials faced no meaningful accountability. By the time the financial system collapsed in 2008, a large part of the American public had already absorbed a lesson that its experience kept confirming. Institutions operate in their own interest. When they fail, the consequences are distributed downward. When they succeed, the rewards accumulate upward. And no one who caused the problem will be asked to pay for it. The response to 2008 reinforced that lesson with unusual clarity. Banks were rescued. Bonuses were paid. Executives retained their positions. Millions of ordinary people lost their homes, their savings, their jobs. And almost no one at the top of those institutions was held criminally accountable for decisions that had brought the global economy to the edge of collapse. This is not a political argument. It is a description of what happened. And what happened, what people watched happening, over years and decades, was the repeated demonstration that the story being told about how institutions worked was not the story that was actually playing out. Meanwhile, the media landscape was fragmenting in ways that made shared reality harder to maintain. When most Americans got their news from a small number of television networks and newspapers, those sources could be criticized, and they deserved criticism, but they at least produced a common factual baseline. Disagreements happened within a shared world of roughly acknowledged facts. As the media multiplied, as algorithms began showing people what they already believed, as the economics of attention replaced the economics of accuracy, that baseline began to dissolve. People were not simply disagreeing about values or interpretations. They were disagreeing about what had actually happened. And when you cannot agree on what happened, trust, which requires a shared world to function, has nothing left to hold on to. All of this unfolded over decades, not overnight. Each layer was thin, but they accumulated, and what they produced was not a population of irrational cynics. They produced a population of people whose distrust, in most cases, was simply a reasonable response to documented experience. What does it actually feel like to live in a world you no longer fully trust? It feels, most of the time, like nothing dramatic. It is too ordinary for drama. It is a series of small pauses, small calculations, small adjustments to behavior that have become so automatic you no longer notice them. You receive an email from your bank asking you to verify your account information. It looks exactly like every other email your bank sends. The logo is correct, the language is plausible, but you do not click the link. You open a new tab, navigate to the bank's website yourself, and log in from there. The whole process takes perhaps 2 extra minutes. It feels like nothing, but multiply those 2 minutes by every interaction in a day that now requires this kind of cautious detour, and the weight of it begins to add up. You are at a doctor's appointment. The doctor recommends a medication. 20 years ago, you might have simply said yes, filled the prescription, and trusted the recommendation. Now you go home, search the drug's name, read about side effects, look for studies, check whether the drug's manufacturer has had any notable lawsuits. This is sensible behavior. In some cases it has probably saved lives. But it is also exhausting. And it carries a particular cost. It means that the expertise you are paying for is now something you must verify rather than simply receive. You are managing your own healthcare in ways that require knowledge you may not have, all because the relationship between the patient and the institution that serves them has lost something essential. You are told by a contractor that the work on your roof will cost a certain amount and will take 2 weeks. Your first response is not to believe them, not because this particular contractor is dishonest, but because you have either been burned before, or you know someone who has, or you have simply absorbed the ambient message that contracts are starting points for negotiation rather than commitments. You call 3 contractors. You read reviews. You ask a friend for a recommendation. You check their license. You write everything down. The roof still leaks sometimes. But at least you did not simply trust someone. This is the texture of a low-trust life. It is not paranoid. It is not even pessimistic in any obvious way. It is simply the adaptation of a sensible person to a world in which experience has taught them that good faith is not a reliable prediction of outcome. But the cost is real. And one of the clearest places it shows up is in loneliness. Trust and community are deeply connected. A neighborhood functions as more than a collection of houses when neighbors trust each other enough to borrow a tool, watch a child, accept help during an illness, report a concern. These are small things, but they are the connective tissue of a community, and they require a baseline assumption of goodwill that, in many places, has become hard to maintain. People describe the change in various ways. They say neighbors do not know each other anymore. They say people keep to themselves. They say you do not feel comfortable asking for help the way you once might have, not because anyone has been unkind, but because the air between people has changed. There is a protective distance that did not used to be there. And in its presence, the small transactions of neighborly life, the borrowing, the checking in, the unannounced drop-by, have become harder to initiate and harder to receive. This matters especially for older adults, for whom community connection is not an optional comfort but a practical necessity. Older adults are also, not coincidentally, the most frequently targeted group in financial fraud. Scam calls, fraudulent emails, impersonation schemes that exploit legitimate-sounding urgency. These arrive with enough regularity that wariness is not just rational but necessary. But the psychological toll of living in that state of alert, of never quite being able to answer the phone with ease, of never quite trusting an unexpected kindness, is a specific kind of suffering that rarely gets named as what it is. Attacks on daily life, levied by a world that does not feel safe enough to be open. And then there is the deeper loneliness, the loneliness of not knowing who to believe. When you cannot agree on what is true, When every headline seems to have an agenda, every expert seems to be contested by another expert, every institution seems to be speaking in the interest of someone other than you, then you are left to navigate a complex world largely alone. Your own judgment, your own experience, your own reading of limited information becomes your only reliable compass. This is a heavy thing to carry, and people carry it daily, often without acknowledging how heavy it has become. To understand what we are actually losing when trust declines, it helps to think about what trust actually does, not sentimentally, but functionally. What does trust make possible that its absence takes away? Trust is, at its core, social infrastructure. It is the invisible system that reduces the cost of cooperation. In a high-trust environment, you can act on the assumption that most people will behave consistently with what they have said, that agreements will generally be honored, that strangers encountered in public are more likely to be harmless than threatening. You do not need to verify every transaction, monitor every interaction, or demand guarantees before every exchange. This frees up a remarkable amount of human energy and attention for other things. Economists have studied this at the level of entire countries. Societies with higher social trust, as measured by surveys asking people whether they believe most others can generally be trusted, consistently show higher rates of economic cooperation, more civic participation, better health outcomes, and more resilience in the face of collective challenges. This is not because trustful societies are populated by unusually good people. It is because trust is an efficiency mechanism. It lowers the friction of collective life. By contrast, low-trust societies face what might be called a coordination problem that never goes away. Every transaction requires more negotiation, more protection, more enforcement. People invest in defensive rather than productive behavior. Energy that might have gone into building things goes instead into protecting against loss. This is not a moral observation. It is a description of a system that has a higher operating cost. And the thing about that operating cost is that it is not distributed equally. People with resources can afford lawyers to write contracts, accountants to check statements, advisors to navigate complexity. People without resources cannot. They absorb the cost of a low-trust world more directly, more personally, and with fewer buffers. The erosion of trust is, in this sense, also an equity problem, though it is rarely discussed that way. But there is another dimension to trust that does not show up in economic models, and it may be the most important one. Trust is connected to freedom in a way that is not immediately obvious. We tend to think of freedom as the absence of external constraint, the freedom to go where you want, say what you think, make your own choices. But there is another kind of freedom that depends not on the absence of restriction but on the presence of reliable conditions. The freedom to make a long-term plan. The freedom to enter a relationship without an exit strategy already prepared. The freedom to accept help without calculating the hidden cost. The freedom to believe what you are told and spend your attention on something other than verification. A person who cannot trust, who must approach every situation with defensiveness already in place, is not free in this second sense. They are constrained by the need to protect themselves at all times. They cannot fully commit to anything, because commitment requires a kind of faith in continuity that distrust makes impossible. They cannot fully belong anywhere, because belonging requires letting down a guard that experience has taught them to keep up. This is the dignitary cost of a low-trust world. It asks people to live smaller, to want less, to extend themselves less far, to keep more of themselves in reserve. And what makes this particularly difficult is that the distrust is, in most cases, earned. It is not irrational. It is the rational response of people who have been let down by institutions that told them one thing and did another. People who were promised stability and received insecurity. People who were told their voices mattered and watched their influence dwindle. People who extended trust, in good faith, to systems that took it and did not reciprocate. Cynicism is often treated as a personality flaw, a kind of emotional surrender, a failure of generosity. But for most people who carry it, cynicism is not a character trait. It is a record. It is the accumulated evidence of what happened when they trusted and were not met with trustworthiness in return. To call that cynicism weakness is to misread it entirely. It is, in most cases, intelligence applied to experience. The trouble is that this intelligence, however understandable, has its own costs. A society in which everyone is a reasonable cynic is a society in which the conditions for trust can never rebuild themselves. Institutions become less trustworthy because no one holds them accountable in the old ways. Civic participation falls, shared norms erode, collective action becomes harder. And as institutions become less trustworthy, individual distrust deepens. The cycle is self-reinforcing. There is also a more personal version of this trap. A person who has learned not to trust can stop distinguishing between situations that deserve suspicion and situations that do not. Wariness becomes a default setting rather than a calibrated response. And a life organized around self-protection, even intelligent self-protection, is a life that has given up a great deal of what makes connection possible. The person behind the wall may be safe, but they are also alone. This is worth sitting with for a moment, not as a judgment, but as an honest description. The world as it is has given people real reasons to protect themselves. And the cost of that protection, when multiplied across millions of lives and decades of accumulated wariness, is a society that has become quieter, more isolated, and harder to move collectively toward anything. What trust made possible was not just efficiency. It was a particular kind of shared life, one in which people could be, at least some of the time, genuinely open to each other. That openness is not a luxury. It is one of the things that makes a long life feel, in the end, worth having lived. There is no satisfying conclusion to offer here. Trust of the kind we are describing, the diffuse, ambient social trust that makes a culture feel habitable, does not return because someone makes a compelling argument for it. It returns, if it returns at all, through the slow accumulation of experiences in which institutions behave as they claim to, in which people are met with consistency rather than disappointment, in which being open is not reliably punished. That process is long, and in some places, it has not yet begun. But there is something worth naming about the difference between carrying distrust and understanding it. Because there is a version of cynicism that is simply exhausting to maintain, not because it is wrong, but because it requires constant energy and produces very little except a kind of defended isolation. And there is a different version, harder to reach, that understands exactly why trust became difficult, can see the forces that eroded it, and is therefore less confused and less corroded by the experience. The second version is not less realistic. It is, in some ways, more precise. It knows that the problem is structural, not personal. It knows that the neighbor who does not wave is probably not malicious. It knows that the doctor who seems rushed is working within a system that rewards volume over attention. It knows that the institution that disappointed you did not do so because you were naive. It did so because that is what that institution, in that moment, chose to do. That is useful knowledge. It replaces a vague, corrosive sense that the world is hostile with something cleaner. A clear-eyed view of specific failures and their specific causes. This is also, in a quiet way, a form of freedom. Because if distrust is the appropriate response to particular conditions, then it is also possible to notice when those conditions are not present. To see that not every interaction is a negotiation with a hidden agenda. That not every stranger is a threat. That most people, in most situations, are doing something much more ordinary than deceiving you. They are managing their own lives, with their own pressures, and they have relatively little time to spend on elaborate schemes against anyone. That is not naivety, it is proportion. There is a distinction worth drawing between naive trust and honest trust. Naive trust ignores evidence, extends itself indiscriminately, and is surprised by betrayal. Honest trust extends itself carefully, with eyes open, knowing the risk, because the alternative, the life of permanent defense, is also a kind of loss. Honest trust is not the absence of skepticism. It is skepticism that has been applied, has found no reason for alarm in a particular situation, and has made a considered choice to proceed. Most days, that choice is available. Most interactions, even now, are not traps. Most people who help you are not calculating a hidden cost. The world has become more complicated, and the institutions that shape large-scale life have given people genuine reasons for caution. But the street is not hostile. The neighbor is not an adversary. The cashier who thanks you is not performing. The tiredness that comes from a low-trust world is real. It is earned. It deserves to be acknowledged rather than dismissed. You did not invent it, and you are not wrong to feel it. But you are also allowed to put it down, sometimes, carefully, with awareness, and to see what is there when the vigilance is not constantly running. What is there, in most moments, is ordinary life. People trying to get things done. People who are, like you, tired in some version of the same way. People who have also absorbed some version of what the world has been teaching, and who are also, somewhere inside that lesson, looking for a little less distance. That is not a solution. It is not an answer to the structural problems that eroded trust in the first place. Those problems require accountability, policy, time, and collective will that no individual can provide. But in the meantime, in the daily texture of ordinary life, there is still a choice about how to carry the weight of what experience has taught. And perhaps the most honest thing that can be said is this: trust was not wrong. The world that asked people to trust, and then failed them, was wrong. The response, the caution, the distance, the wariness, is understandable. But it was not supposed to be permanent. It was supposed to be a bridge to something better. That bridge is still worth walking toward, even slowly, even carefully, even now. ###. Suggested thumbnail text. Trust disappeared. We stopped believing. The world changed its word. Nothing feels certain. When did we stop trusting? ###. Suggested video description. Something has changed in the atmosphere of daily life. Not loudly, and not all at once. But somewhere along the way, the background trust that used to make ordinary life feel manageable, the trust in your bank, your doctor, your news, your neighbors, your government, began to thin. In this episode of The Quiet Briefing, we explore why trust eroded, when it started, and what that loss has actually cost us. We look at the decades of institutional failures, broken promises, and quiet betrayals that made a low-trust world feel rational. We consider what it feels like to live under constant vigilance, second-guessing everything, protecting yourself from everyone. And we ask what, if anything, can be understood more clearly about a society that has forgotten how to take people at their word. This is not a video about conspiracy theories or political outrage. It is about something quieter and more universal: the slow disappearance of the belief that most people, most of the time, are doing their honest best. The Quiet Briefing, calm, long-form reflections on money, aging, society, and modern life. ###. Fact-check notes. Verify Gallup historical data on trust in the federal government, the 3/4 figure for early 1960s. Verify Edelman Trust Barometer figures on current institutional trust levels in the U.S. Verify Putnam's bowling alone and subsequent research on social capital and trust trends. Verify specifics of the 2008 financial crisis aftermath, executive accountability, prosecutions, bonuses paid. Verify historical data on pension coverage and decline since the 1980s. Verify data on financial fraud targeting older adults, FTC or equivalent source. Verify the claim about Watergate polling impact on government trust. Verify any specific figures cited about high trust versus low trust societies and economic performance.